And now we move on to testing selectors. I'm happy to announce that in general, selectors are one of the easiest parts of the React ecosystem to test. Just like testing reducers only required us to define an initial state and an action, testing selectors generally only requires us to define the relevant parts of the state. So testing the base selectors that simply pull something out of the state as is a bit of a no-brainer. I'm not going to spend any time demonstrating it. However, if we move on to our slightly more complicated selectors, there are a few tricks to testing them. As an example, let's see how to test our getCompletedToDos selector. Now, the first and most obvious way to test our getCompletedToDos selector would be to simply recreate the whole state and pass it to our getCompletedToDos to test that it returns the right data. And in our case, this would work fine since our state is so small and we haven't yet built up a big library of selectors that use the results of other selectors. However, in practice, especially as our app gets bigger, as I've said, the only thing we really need to test is the last function that we pass to create selector. So for example, we would have already tested this getToDos selector, so we'd be recreating the entire state just to test that this last function we've defined here works correctly. And that's not really necessary. So this is where the reselect library provides us with a nice solution. The selectors that we create using the createSelector function have a property called resultFunc. So if we say getCompletedToDos.resultFunc, and what this is here is just a reference to the last function that we passed to createSelector. And we can use this in our tests to simply pass in whatever previous selector results our selector requires. So we could define some fake to-dos and simply pass them in here instead of having to recreate the whole state. So that might sound a little complicated. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start off by creating a file to hold our selector tests. We'll call it selectors.test.js. And inside here, we'll start off by importing expect from chai, and then we'll import our getCompletedToDos selector. Import getCompletedToDos from ... selectors. And then we'll set up our test the same way that we've done with our other ecosystem pieces. We'll say describe the getCompletedToDos selector, and we'll say it returns only completed to-dos. And here's where the actual testing logic comes in. What we can do is simply define the to-dos list that would be returned by getToDos in our selector, right here. So we'll say const fake to-dos equals array, and we'll just define some fake to-dos. Say text, say hello, is completed true, text, say goodbye, is completed false, and text, climb Mount Everest, is completed definitely false. And then we define the results that we expect our selector to return when the to-dos array in our state is the one that we just defined. So we'll say const expected equals an array with only this completed to-do in it. And then to get the actual results, we say const actual. And here's where we're going to use the resultFunc property of our selector that I mentioned earlier. We'll say getCompletedToDos dot resultFunc called with fake to-dos. And then we simply have to check that our actual was deep equal to our expected. And that's it. All we have to do when testing reselect selectors, that is, provided we're good coding citizens and test all of our selectors, even these ones up here, is define what data should be returned by the smaller selectors that our current selector relies on, and then use the result func to pass that data as arguments into the final function we pass to our selector. And if we run our tests now with npm run test, we should see that all of our tests pass. Last but not least, we're going to move on to the subject of testing styled components. Now, the method for this one is generally pretty simple. We don't exactly test our full styled components. The only thing that we can really test in our styled components is the logic we put inside them. For example, when we use the created at property on a to-do item to decide whether or not to display a red border at the bottom in the list. So what we should do in this case, in order to be able to test this logic efficiently, is pull this logic out into its own function. So what we're going to do is say export const get border style for date, or something like that, equals, and we're going to say starting date and current date. And this is going to be a slightly modified version of what we did down here. So we're going to say starting date is greater than new date current date minus 8,640,000, which again is the number of milliseconds in a day, times 5. And if this condition is true, we're going to say none. And if it's false, we're going to return the solid red border. 2 pixels solid red. And now what we're going to do, and instead of having all that logic inside this styled component here, we're going to say props get border style for date. And for our current date, we're going to say new date props dot created at. And for the starting date, we're going to say date.now. And again, the reason we would go to the trouble of doing something like this, well, first of all, it makes our styled components more readable, in my opinion, but it also allows us to test this logic that we have in here. So let's create a new test, and we're going to call it to-do list item.test.js. If we were to create a separate file for our styled components, this would be something like styled.test.js. And this is going to be pretty much the same setup as with our other tests. We'll say import expect from chai. And then we'll import our get border style for date from ... to-do list item. And we're going to set up our tests just like we've done in the other videos. We'll say describe get border style for date. And then we're going to say it returns none when the date is less than 5 days ago. And we'll have another test that says it returns a border when the date is more than 5 days ago. And now that we have that, the actual testing is going to be really easy. All we have to say is const today equals date.now, const recent date equals new date, date.now, and we'll make it for 3 days ago this time. So 86,400,000 times 3. And then we'll say const expected equals none, and const actual equals get border style for date, recent date, and today. And then we just have to check if our expected and actual values match. So we'll say expect actual to equal expected. And if we run that first test now, we'll see that that passes just fine. And writing the second test is going to be pretty similar to the first test. The only difference is that instead of having it be just 3 days ago, we're going to have it be 7 days ago. And our expected value in this case is going to be 2 pixels solid red. You may or may not want to get that specific in your tests. So if we run our tests again now, we see that that passes as well. So that's pretty much the basics for testing styled components. In other words, you don't actually test the styled components themselves, you merely pull out the logic that's contained inside them and test that on its own. Well, we've covered quite a few topics in this course. We started off by creating a basic React application from scratch, and then used this as a jumping off point to learn about the many different ecosystem tools that are available to us, including Redux, thunk, reselect, and styled components. We learned the basics of each of these technologies, such as how it works and why it's useful, and then we walked through the process of adding each of them and integrating them into our React project. And last but not least, we saw how to test all the ecosystem pieces that we covered in this course. So now that you've gotten a solid introduction to the React ecosystem, you might be wondering where to go next. Well, there are several things I'd recommend here. First and foremost, I'd recommend that you start trying to use the ecosystem